So Linus opens it up on the button with 9 of spades, 9 of diamonds, 2.13x the big blind. Obviously, nines are a clear open here, so nothing controversial about that. However, there are a few unique details in this situation that are worth examining so that we can explore the importance of the concept of elasticity in poker. Generally, in mathematics and economics, elasticity describes the degree to which changes made to inputs in a given formula alter the outputs. So, what does that have to do with poker? Well, in a broad sense, sound poker strategies are devised by identifying what the important inputs are in a hand scenario, analyzing those inputs, and then formulating a decision or output that is likely to maximize profits given those specific inputs. Most capable players understand conceptually the importance of elasticity in this context, but being able to accurately calibrate how much our output should change given slight modifications to inputs is a very nuanced problem. Fortunately, we can use solvers to calculate precise answers to this question. When working with solvers, the relevant inputs are the pot size, the effective stack size, the board, and the player's actions. And in this video, we're going to use a suite of tools from Simple Poker to objectively examine how relatively subtle differences in two of these inputs, namely SPR and bet sizes, can dramatically change optimal strategies in a quantifiable manner. So getting back to the hand, one thing to note off the bat here is that Linus and Jasam Gale are relatively short stacked. Linus has 40 big blinds and Ja has around 63 big blinds, whereas typically in cash games, regs buy in and top up to maintain at least 100 big blinds at all times. So how does the shorter effective stack affect strategies? Well, in Linus's shoes, we see that the solver opens significantly wider, almost 5%, with a 100 big blind stack versus a 40 big blind stack, despite all other variables being the same. The primary driver of this increase are these suited combinations, which the solver may be incorporating due in part to the enhanced implied odds when deeper stacked, associated with the potential of hitting flushes. And commensurate with the wider opening range, we see that the solver trends towards choosing the smaller 2.13x sizing in the 100 big blind sim, whereas comparatively in the 40 big blind sim, the solver is choosing the 3x sizing more frequently, as there's often an inverse correlation between bet sizing and bet frequency. Ja 3-bets with Queen of Diamonds, King of Clubs in the big blind around 3.75x Linus's bet, and we see that at this stack depth, the solver is mixing its play between calling, raising this sizing, and raising 5x. However, if we switch over to the 100 big blind sim, we see that the solver overwhelmingly favors the larger 5x raise in this spot, again despite all other variables being the same. Generally speaking, when using an aggressive, more polarizing strategy, the solver will tend to use larger sizings when deeper stacked to begin geometrically growing the pot with a view of potentially getting all the chips in by the river. In that same vein, when we take a look at the big blind's defense strategy versus different button open sizes, we see a trend towards utilizing smaller 3-bet sizes as the button's open size gets larger, which makes sense since the button's larger open decreases the SPR relative to the smaller open. Additionally, we see that the big blind is defending much less frequently overall as the button sizing increases. And if we go back to the 40 big blind sim, we see the same pattern. As the button's open size gets larger, the big blind defends less frequently, and its 3-bet size as a percentage of the button's open trends smaller. It should be noted that the types of combos that the solver chooses to 3-bet change dramatically as well when the SPR is decreased. Right, in the 100 big blind sim, we see that most of the 3-bet bluffs are allocated to suited combinations, whereas in the 40 big blind sim, most of the 3-bet bluffs are allocated to offsuit Broadway combos and pocket pairs. As mentioned previously, when the SPR increases, generally the solver tends to favor hands that have drawing properties due to the increased implied odds, and when the SPR is shorter, generally the solver tends to favor combos with higher rank that can make strong one-paired hands. For example, we see that in the 40 big blind sim, the solver is 3-betting nearly all of its unsuited ace-x combos with some frequency. Right, if villain calls and hero makes top pair, he's not going to be too concerned about getting coolered against a better kicker since the quantum of overall risk is reduced, whereas in the 100 big blind game, the solver generally will not want to play for stacks with a pair of aces when holding a weak kicker. Linus calls, and interestingly, the solver is doing quite a bit of four-betting with pocket nines in the 40 big blind sim. In fact, most pocket pairs between sevens and queens are four-betting, whereas kings and aces are simply flatting virtually 100% of the time. Again, this is likely due to the shorter SPR, where although one pair of hands are played more aggressively generally speaking, aces and kings appear to be content with keeping the weaker portion of the opponent's range intact, and it shouldn't be too difficult to get stacks in by the river in a 3-bet pot. If we contrast this to the 100 big blind sim, we see the opposite effect, where aces, kings, and queens are 4-betting 100% of the time, whereas the lower pocket pairs primarily flat. Additionally, we see that the solver is calling more broadly in the 100 big blind sim in general, particularly with hands that benefit from higher implied odds, such as suited combos and lower pocket pairs. The flop comes 6 king 8 with 2 spades, and Jaw continues with a third pot bet, and we see that the solver is essentially range betting with this sizing. This king high, somewhat disconnected board is favorable to the preflop aggressor, resulting in the big blind having a 56 to 44% edge in average equity. However, when we compare this to the 100 big blind sim, we see that the solver is playing much more passively. The equities are identical, and the big blind is still betting most of its range. However, we see that the gap in average expected value is much more pronounced in the 40 big blind game. The reason for this, again, likely boils down to the SPR, since the advantages associated with position are mitigated as the SPR becomes shorter. Right, in this scenario, the big blind should have the dominating top pairs, overpairs, and sets on this board, and the value of the button's draws are diminished due to the lesser implied odds in the 40 big blind game. Linus calls, and we see that all pocket nines are calling this small bet. In fact, all pocket pairs down to pocket sevens are calling, and it's only pocket fives and below where the solver begins to fold without the backdoor flush draw. Comparing this to the 100 big blind sim, we see that the defending strategy is largely the same, other than with respect to the percentage of raises, where in the 100 big blind sim, the solver is doing significantly more raising. This is consistent with the theme of the solver wanting to grow the pot geometrically with the polar part of its range when deeper stacked, whereas in the 40 big blind sim, the button sets, two pairs, and overpairs are mostly just calling, since they should have ample opportunity later on to get stacks in by the river, and they also require less protection against draws in light of the lower magnitude of risk. The turn is the ace of spades, and Jaw checks. The ace is quite favorable for the preflop aggressor, since on the flop he should have c-bet most of his aces, whereas Linus should have folded many of his aces. However, even though the solver bets with highest frequency on ace turns, Jaw has a much smaller proportion of flushes, given that, as discussed preflop, the solver heavily favored 3-bet bluffing with offsuit combos. As such, we see that overall, the solver checks with greatest frequency on flush turns. The net result of these considerations is that the solver is largely mixing its play with its second pairs. Interestingly, with king-queen in particular, the solver bets with greater frequency without the flush draw and checks most of its king-queen combos with the flush draw. Apparently, the incremental equity provided by the flush draw in this specific spot shifts the king-queen combos with the flush draw into equity realization mode, whereas without the spade, the solver utilizes the favorable turn card to apply fold equity. I would caution not to read too much into this, however, since when we take a look at these king-jack and king-10 combos, the opposite is true, where the solver is more aggressive when holding the spade. These types of fine lines delineated by the solver are very difficult to replicate in real play, so most people generally will be better off playing their flush draws more aggressively across the board as a general rule of thumb. That being said, given Jaw's check, we're going to node lock some frequency of checks for some of these king-queen combos without the spade. Linus checks behind, which we see is consistent with the solver strategy that is content to pot control with this third pair that doesn't have a strong incentive to bet, since it would likely only cause weaker hands to fold. The river is the 9 of hearts, and Jaw makes a very small 18% pot block bet. The solver is not doing much betting with this sizing at all. This may be due in part to the fact that line is checked back on the turn, which signals a medium strength hand, somewhat capping his range. Against a capped range, the solver will tend to use larger sizings, since the out-of-position player will often have a significant range advantage in this scenario. Right, the paradigm situation to use a block bet is when the out-of-position player holds a medium-strength hand on a dangerous board, as it's designed to set a price against an in-position player that has an incentive to simply close the action on the river. However, given Jaw's block, we're going to allocate a few more bets with this sizing across some of these second pairs, top pairs, sets, and straights. So with less than a pot size bet behind, Linus shoves his set of nines, which we see is consistent with the solver strategy despite the 3 flush cards on the board. In fact, all flushes, sets, and 2 pairs with an ace or king are shoving in this spot. And for balance, the solver also throws in a few bluffs as well, predominantly with the flush blocker. Overall, we see that the solver is doing quite a bit of raising here, which will often occur when facing a very small block bet. Right, given that most of the hands that want a block bet are of the medium strength variety, a block bet will largely cap the better's range, making him vulnerable to a raise. And along the same lines, we see that as the big blind's bet sizes increases and its range strengthens, the frequency of the button shoving trends downwards, which again is evidence of the importance of being cognizant of and sensitive to the bet sizes being used. Jaw calls, and we see that King Queen is right on the cusp of the solver's calling/folding range, where the big blind is getting decent odds to call despite only having second pair. Not surprisingly, the solver strongly favors calling when holding the spade blocker, but we see that the solver is also splitting calling and folding with Jaw's particular holding, where the EVs between the two actions are identical. So in this hand, we've witnessed a number of examples of how slight changes to stack and bet sizes can result in a cascading alteration of the optimal pathways in the GTO game tree. This notion of elasticity is something that novice players often overlook, but as you move up the food chain, where the edges become more and more narrow, recognizing these types of input changes and having a sense of how to calibrate counter strategies in response can make all the difference between winning and losing in the long run. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay at home.